The Valgreth Dominion had not lost a war in 9,000 years. Not one, not a skirmish, not a border dispute, not a last-stand rebellion on some dying colony world. 9,000 years of absolute, unbroken military supremacy across 11,000 star systems. Their warships were so large that smaller civilizations mistook them for moons when they first appeared in orbit. Their weapons did not merely destroy targets, they reshaped geography. They turned oceans into glass and mountains into dust, and they did it casually, the way a man might swat a fly without breaking his stride. Supreme Warlord Vethgen Azur sat on the Dominion's seat of judgment, a throne carved from the compressed core of the first planet his ancestors had ever conquered. The room around him was not just large, it was deliberately incomprehensible. The ceiling stretched so far above that clouds formed near the top, real clouds, seeded by atmospheric systems installed purely to remind every visitor that they stood inside something built by a civilization that had long since stopped thinking about limits. He was reviewing a report. It had come from a deep-range survey vessel, one of 300 such ships the Dominion kept permanently deployed at the edges of explored space. Their job was to find things worth taking. This particular report was about a small, unremarkable system near what the Dominion's charts labeled the Outer Silence, a region of sparse stars that nobody had bothered mapping properly because there was no strategic reason to. The system had one inhabited world, a wet planet, nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere, single moon, moderate axial tilt, nothing special by any measurable standard. The species called it Earth. The survey commander, a veteran officer named Drath Saloon, had compiled a detailed analysis. Drath was thorough, he was methodical, he was, by all accounts, extremely good at his job. His report concluded that the humans were a pre-contact species in the late stages of initial interstellar exploration. They had figured out faster-than-light travel approximately 2 centuries ago. Their ships used outdated compression drive technology. Their weapons were kinetic-based, supplemented by directed energy systems that the Dominion considered primitive 4,000 years ago. Their total military capacity, Drath estimated, was roughly equivalent to a Dominion patrol squadron. Not a full squadron, a patrol squadron, the kind the Dominion sent to check on quiet border systems once every decade. The report included imagery, green continents, blue oceans, cities that glittered at night like scattered sparks. The humans had built some impressive structures by their own standards. They clearly had ambition. They had spread to their moon, to the red planet next door, to several moons around their outer gas giants. Cute, Vethgen thought. His senior council gathered at his summons, 12 of the finest military minds in Dominion history. They looked at the images of Earth, they read Drath's numbers, they performed their own calculations. Grand Marshal Pyreth, who had personally overseen the conquest of 47 civilizations and was considered something close to a living legend within the Dominion's military hierarchy, summed up the consensus. "This will not be a campaign," Pyreth said flatly. "This will be a collection. We arrive, we announce terms, they comply. We catalog their world, assign a governing overseer, and move on. Total elapsed time from first contact to full administrative integration, I would estimate 6 standard days, possibly fewer. Several council members nodded. A few looked almost disappointed at how little challenge was involved. "Their planet has exceptional mineral deposits," noted Supply Commander Jackson Vro. "The ocean chemistry is unusual, interesting compounds. Their biological diversity is also remarkable. The agricultural potential alone would justify the annexation." "And the humans?" Vethkin asked. Vro glanced at his datapad. "Labor capacity is strong, physically durable species. They appear to have high pain tolerance and significant psychological resilience. They would function well in resource extraction roles. The younger individuals in particular show adaptability profiles that would be useful in technical labor divisions." Vethkin leaned back. 9,000 years. 11,000 systems. Earth would be 11,001. "Take 400 warships," he told Pyrath. "I want the display to be educational. These humans have apparently been exploring their region for 2 centuries without encountering a true power. They may not understand what they are seeing when we arrive. Make it clear." Pyrath bowed. He did not argue for fewer ships, though 400 was comically excessive. He understood the Emperor's point. This was not about military necessity. It was about theater. It was about showing a young species the size of the stage they had just accidentally wandered onto. "We depart within the week," Pyrath said. Nobody in that room felt anything close to concern. Nobody in that room thought to ask why a species with 2 centuries of interstellar capability had not already been found and absorbed by one of the other powers operating in that region of space. Nobody thought to ask why, in 200 years of exploration, the humans had apparently never encountered a single hostile contact. Nobody thought to ask why Earth was still free. The fleet prepared, the soldiers drilled, the supply ships loaded, the capital buzzed with the casual energy of an empire preparing for routine business. Out in the dark between stars, something ancient opened one eye and began to watch. It had been expecting company. 231 years before Grand Marshal Piran Eth ever looked at a holographic image of Earth, a geologist named Oren Vasht made the discovery that changed everything. He was not supposed to be famous. He was not the kind of man who expected to be. Oren was methodical, quiet, more comfortable with rock samples than with people. He had taken a contract position on the Martian research station at Hellas Basin because the pay was decent and the isolation suited him. He liked the silence of the red planet. He liked the way the dust moved in thin, slow curtains across the plains in the morning. He was running a subsurface density scan on a Tuesday. The readings that came back made no sense. He ran them again. Same result. He recalibrated the equipment and ran them a 3rd time, assuming malfunction. The readings did not change. Beneath the Martian surface, at a depth that should have contained nothing but compressed basalt and ancient volcanic rock, the scanner was showing a structure, a large one, geometrically regular in ways that geology could not produce, vast in a way that made Oren sit very still for a long moment, his coffee going cold on the console beside him.
He wrote up his findings carefully. He sent them to the station director. He did not tell anyone else because Oren was the kind of man who understood that some things needed to be handled quietly until they were better understood. It took 3 weeks to get the first excavation team in place. It took another 2 months to reach the outer skin of the structure. When they finally cut through and descended inside, Oren stood at the front of the group and felt the air change around him. The atmosphere inside was different, not dangerous, just different, older somehow, preserved. The facility was enormous. It did not look like a cave system or a buried city. It looked like something built with absolute intentionality, every surface serving a function, every passageway leading somewhere deliberate. The materials were unlike anything in human metallurgical databases. The instruments inside were still active, drawing power from sources the engineers could not immediately identify. The computers still ran. They had been running for approximately 60 million years. The records they contained were extensive. It took the team of xenolinguists 7 months to develop a working translation framework, and then something strange happened. The language in the records did not need translating, not exactly. The information seemed to reorganize itself in ways that the readers could comprehend, as though the archive had been designed to meet the reader halfway, as though it had been waiting for exactly this moment and had prepared accordingly. The records told a story. A species had existed in this galaxy long before any currently living civilization. They called themselves, in their own language, something that translated most naturally as the Shareth. The Shareth being a word that also carried connotations of firstness, of origin, of that which existed before the naming of things. In their own understanding of themselves, they were simply the ones who had been here at the beginning.
They had been remarkable. Not in a flashy, warlike way, but in the patient way of something that had genuinely figured out how existence worked at its most fundamental level. They understood space-time the way a carpenter understands wood, with an intimacy that came from long practice and deep attention. They had explored the galaxy thoroughly. They had found it beautiful and largely empty of minds. So they had done something about that. The seeding program had taken millions of years. The Sharath had traveled to thousands of worlds and carefully, precisely introduced the biological preconditions for intelligent life. Each world was selected based on complex criteria. Each introduced genome was tailored. Each emerging species was monitored from a respectful distance, allowed to develop without interference. The Sharath did not want to be parents. They wanted to be legacy. Eventually, as all things do, the Sharath came to their end. Not violently, not through catastrophe, simply through the natural completion of what they were. They had seeded the stars. They had done their work. What remained of them was preserved, not bodies, but knowledge. And that knowledge was stored in facilities like the one beneath Mars, distributed across the galaxy in places that would only be found when the species finding them was ready. Earth, the records explained, was not one of the seeded worlds. Earth was something different. Earth was the Sharath homeworld. Humanity were not the Sharath. Humanity were the Sharath,
or rather the descendants of those few Sharath who had chosen to remain behind, to start over, to shed everything and begin again without memory, without technology, without the weight of 9-figure-year civilizational history pressing down on every decision. It had been a deliberate choice, a reset, a chance to grow up fresh in a galaxy their ancestors had spent millions of years preparing. The technology left behind was not a gift. It was an inheritance. Governments were contacted, emergency summits convened, the information was shared in carefully controlled stages with heads of state who were then required to sit quietly in soundproofed rooms while they processed what they had just been told. Some wept, some laughed. One prime minister, by all accounts a normally composed and serious-minded individual, simply stared at the ceiling for 45 minutes without speaking. The decision that emerged from those summits was unanimous and immediate. Nobody could know. The inheritance would be studied, the technology would be learned, the defense systems the Sharath had left scattered through the solar system, dormant installations disguised as natural objects, drawing on zero-point energy, armed with weapons that operated on principles current physics could barely describe, would be quietly mapped, quietly activated, quietly mastered. But to the rest of the galaxy, Earth would remain exactly what it appeared to be: young, naive, harmless. Primitive little humanity just learning to walk among the stars. The trap was set. They simply needed someone foolish enough to walk into it.
43 minutes. Grand Marshal Pyrith dropped his fleet out of transit drive at the heliopause of the Sol system and took a long, satisfied look at what he had come to collect. 400 warships materialized in perfect formation. Their combined mass displaced enough gravitational field to be measurable on instruments back on Earth. Their drives glowed, their weapons were charged, their shields were active at 30%, the Dominion's standard approach posture for non-threatening targets, which was itself a form of arrogance. They were not even bothering to fully shield. "Scan the system," Pyrith ordered. "Full spectrum. I want to know exactly what we're dealing with." The sensors swept. The report came back matching everything in Droth Saloon's original survey. A handful of human vessels scattered through the inner system. Ancient-looking technology, no significant fortifications. The installations on the Moon and on Mars were research facilities, not military bases. Earth's orbital defenses were present but thin, built more for debris management than for actual combat. The system looked exactly as reported. It looked exactly as it was designed to look. Pyrith opened a broadband channel, transmitting on every frequency the human communications networks used. "People of Earth," he said, his translator units rendering the words in every human language simultaneously. "This is Grand Marshal Pyrith Valdoon of the Valgreth Dominion. Your system is hereby claimed under Dominion authority. You will cease all military activities. You will power down all weapon systems. You will prepare to receive administrative representatives. Compliance within 6 of your hours will be treated as cooperation, and your population will be processed accordingly. Non-compliance will be treated as hostility. You have been warned." He sat back and waited.
His communications officer looked up after 2 minutes. "We have a response, Grand Marshal." "Play it." A single human voice, calm, almost bored. "You have entered protected space. Leave now. This offer will not be repeated." Pyrath stared at his console. His bridge crew exchanged glances. Several officers were visibly suppressing smiles. "Are they serious?" someone murmured. "Apparently," someone else replied, and failed to fully suppress a laugh. Pyrath was not laughing. He was not angry either. He was simply done. He had given the required warning. The humans had declined. The next step was standard.
All ships advance formation. Accelerate to attack speed. Charge weapons to full. Target their orbital installations first, then the surface defense grid. Controlled fire only. We want the planet intact. The fleet moved. 400 warships accelerating toward Earth, their formation so vast it blotted out stars behind them. They crossed the orbit of the outermost planet. Nothing. They crossed the next orbit. Still nothing. The human vessels in the system were maintaining their positions, but making no aggressive movements, not retreating either, just holding. Pyrath noted this and found it slightly unusual. Usually, by this point, primitive species were either fleeing or desperately attempting to transmit surrender signals. The humans were doing neither. "Grand Marshal," the sensor officer's voice had changed, just slightly, just enough. "I'm reading new energy signatures, multiple contacts, across the outer system." "The human ships?" "No, sir. Different sources. Objects we previously catalogued as natural formations. Asteroids, comets. They are—" A pause, a longer pause than Pyrath liked. "They are not asteroids, sir." The tactical display updated. Red contact markers bloomed across the screen. Dozens, hundreds, they were everywhere, distributed through the entire solar system in a pattern that Pyrath now realized with a cold dropping sensation in his stomach was not random at all. It was a grid, a defensive grid of extraordinary density, and every single node of it had just come alive simultaneously. "Power readings are—" The sensor officer stopped speaking for a moment. When she continued, her voice was very quiet. "Grand Marshal, I cannot find a reference point for these readings. They exceed every scale in our database." Pyrath had fought 100 engagements. He had never felt what he felt in that moment. It was not precisely fear. It was the particular vertigo of understanding too late that the room you walked into is not the room you thought it was, and the door behind you is no longer there. "All ships, maximum shields, evasive." The first shot erased 27 warships. Not destroyed them, not crippled them, erased. One moment they existed, the next moment the space they occupied was simply empty, and there was not even debris to mark where they had been. The weapons did not fire beams or projectiles. They manipulated the underlying structure of local space-time and quietly removed matter from the equation. Pyrath's fleet returned fire. All 400 ships, all 373 remaining ships, opened up with everything they had. Plasma cannons, graviton lances, mass drivers, resonance weapons. The combined firepower of the Dominion's finest fleet hit the nearest weapons platforms, and the energy washed over shields that should not have been possible, discharged harmlessly, and the platforms continued firing. 40 more ships gone.
The fleet attempted evasive maneuvers. The platforms tracked perfectly, predicting movements before they happened, targeting locations where ships would be rather than where they were. Pyrith tried to jump. The drives engaged. The transit window began forming. It collapsed. He tried again, collapsed again. Something in the solar system's gravity architecture had been subtly altered, creating conditions that prevented stable transit window formation throughout the entire system. They were not simply trapped in a battle, they were trapped in a killing field, designed and prepared by something that had anticipated their arrival.
Then the human warships appeared. Not from transit drives, from nowhere. They materialized in the spaces between the Dominion vessels with a casualness that suggested they found the laws of physics mildly suggestive rather than binding. Their hulls were made of material that seemed to exist in a state of permanent flux, shifting between forms the Dominion sensors could not cleanly resolve. They moved like thought, instantaneous and exact. Each human ship was crude. Pyrith could detect life signs. These were not automated platforms. Humans sat inside these impossible vessels and flew them with the relaxed precision of people doing something they had practiced for a very long time. The human fleet did not rush to overwhelm. It worked methodically. A Dominion ship would find its local time suddenly unstable, its crew experiencing compressed duration, days passing in moments, their systems failing, and their bodies aging through the crisis of temporal dislocation. Another ship would discover that its quantum targeting computers had been infected with prediction data so accurate that every evasive maneuver they attempted was countered before the command was even fully issued. One Dominion captain tried a desperation ramming attack, burning his engines to maximum and pointing his ship directly at the nearest human vessel. The human ship moved aside at the last instant without any visible engine burn, as though it had always been somewhere else, and the Dominion ship drove itself into a gravity anomaly that the humans had apparently placed in that exact position against exactly that eventuality. It had been anticipated. All of it had been anticipated. Pyrith sat in his command chair and watched his fleet die, and understood, with a clarity that stripped away every assumption and every certainty he had carried for his entire career, that they had not come to conquer Earth. They had come to be taught a lesson. A communication request. He accepted it. A human in a plain military uniform appeared in the hologram. The uniform had no decorations, no medals, no rank insignia beyond a small shoulder marking. The human looked middle-aged. He had the kind of face that had seen difficult things and made peace with them. "I am Director Kale Sundren of the Solar Defense Authority," the human said. "You were warned." Pyrith found words from somewhere. "What are you? This technology, your civilization is 200 years old. This is not possible." Kale Sundren looked at him with something that was not quite sympathy and not quite contempt, something in between, perhaps, something closer to the expression of someone watching another person make an obvious mistake. "Our civilization is not 200 years old," Sundren said quietly. "Our civilization is as old as this galaxy's memory. We went to sleep for a while. You woke us up." He paused. "We will allow one ship to leave. One. To carry the record of what happened here back to your leadership. Choose which ship,
and issue the order within the next 4 minutes." The hologram closed. Pirith sat for 3 seconds. Then he opened his fleet channel and spoke the hardest words of his life. "This is Pirith to all surviving vessels. Identify the ship with the most intact drives and prepare for emergency transit. That ship departs in 3 minutes." He paused. "Tell them everything, show them everything, make sure they understand." 43 minutes after the first shot was fired, the solar battle was over. 399 Dominion warships, 0 human casualties. 1 ship limped away through a gap the human fleet deliberately opened, carrying a black box recording of every second of what had occurred. The surviving crew sat in silence as the stars changed around them, none of them speaking, all of them staring at screens that showed a replay they could not stop watching. The galaxy had forgotten something fundamental about the universe it lived in. Earth had just reminded it. Humanity did not announce its power by knocking on the door. It waited until someone kicked the door down, and then it answered. The transmission went out simultaneously on every known communications frequency used by every known species in the catalogued galaxy. It could not be blocked. The signal did not travel through conventional electromagnetic pathways. It arrived the way a thought arrives, instantaneously, present, already inside every receiver before any countermeasure could be considered. Species who had never made radio contact with another civilization found the signal appearing in their earliest experimental equipment. Species with the most sophisticated communications networks in the galaxy found it cutting through their encryption as though the encryption did not exist. The first 12 minutes of the transmission was footage. It began with the arrival of the Valgreth fleet, 400 warships materializing at the edge of the solar system, formation perfect, engines blazing, shields shimmering with the confidence of 9,000 unbroken years of victory. The cameras capturing this were clearly positioned throughout the outer system, placed in advance, waiting, because humanity had known the fleet was coming long before it arrived. The footage showed everything: the defense network activating, the first weapons firing, the systematic disintegration of a fleet that had never imagined it could be systematically disintegrated, the appearance of the human warships materializing between Dominion vessels with that terrible casual precision, the final moments. The single ship allowed to escape, limping out through a corridor of human vessels that made no move to stop it. Total running time of the battle, as displayed in a counter in the corner of the frame, 43 minutes, 17 seconds. Then Director Kale Sundran appeared. He stood in front of a window. Earth was visible behind him, filling the frame, blue and luminous and achingly beautiful against the dark. He spoke without notes, without theatrical pause, without the performance that might have been tempting given the size of the audience. "My name is Kale Sundran. I speak for humanity. I speak for Earth." He waited a moment. "For most of your recorded histories, you have known of our world as a minor presence in the outer silence region. Some of your more thorough researchers may have noted that we were unusually isolated for a species at our apparent developmental stage. Some may have wondered why no empire had absorbed us in 2 centuries of interstellar activity. A few, perhaps, consulted very old records and found warnings in ancient texts, warnings about the Sol system, about the blue world, about the species that lived there." He paused.
Those warnings were correct. The footage behind him shifted, showing images from beneath the Martian surface, the vast, impossibly preserved facility, the technology within, the records. Humanity is the direct descendant of the Sharath, the civilization that seeded this galaxy with life. Every species watching this transmission exists because our ancestors decided they wanted the galaxy to be full of minds. We gave you existence, we gave you the stars, and then we stepped back and watched to see what you would do with those gifts. In the throne room of the Valgreth Dominion's capital, Supreme Warlord Vethkin Ozur sat absolutely still while the transmission played. His council stood around him. Nobody spoke. The recording of the battle had arrived 3 days earlier on the single surviving ship, and since then the capital had been operating in a state of muted, collective shock. The transmission now reaching them was the second blow. On the agricultural world of Venshara, a people who had spent 400 years under Valgreth occupation watched the transmission on hidden receivers clustered together in basements and fields and low places, holding each other's hands. On the Kathrani station, the largest trading hub in the mid-galaxy, a crowd of several hundred beings from 40 different species filled the central concourse and stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the same broadcast on shared screens. Nobody left. Nobody spoke above a whisper. Sundran continued. We did not reveal ourselves until now because revelation requires a reason. We did not want to enter the galaxy as conquerors. We did not want our presence to replace one form of domination with another. We were waiting to understand what the galaxy had become and whether it was ready for us. A pause. The Valgreth Dominion gave us our answer, not the answer we hoped for. He looked directly into the camera. We are stepping out of the shadows now, not to rule, not to punish. We have no interest in empire. What we have interest in is the vision our ancestors held when they seeded the first worlds, the idea that a galaxy full of minds could become something worth having, a community instead of a hierarchy, a conversation instead of a chain of command. The image of Earth behind him remained unchanged, peaceful, beautiful, the kind of world that looked like it needed protecting. That was the point. We are extending an offer to every peaceful species watching this transmission. Our protection is available to those who have suffered under aggressive powers. Our technology is available, in careful measure, to those who demonstrate they will use it responsibly. Our attention is available to any civilization that has been harmed and wants justice.
He was quiet for a moment. We are also extending a warning to those who practice conquest, slavery, or predatory expansion. We are watching. We have always been watching, and we are no longer content to only watch. The transmission ended. For approximately 6 seconds after it concluded, there was silence across 1,000 worlds. Then, the galaxy began to move. Diplomatic requests flooded Sol's communication networks within hours. Species that had endured decades or centuries of Valgreth occupation began organizing resistance movements, emboldened by the evidence that the Valgreth were not invulnerable. Smaller aggressive powers rapidly convened emergency councils. Military strategists who had spent careers planning expansion campaigns quietly began revising those plans, then more quietly began abandoning them entirely. In the archives of 100 civilizations, scholars pulled old texts and found the references they had always dismissed as mythology.
The sleepers of the first world, the children of the before time, the guardians who dreamed. Every culture had its own version of the story, passed down in fragments, corrupted by distance and time, but always containing the same core elements: an ancient people, a blue world in a quiet corner of the galaxy, a warning not to disturb them. The warning had been there all along. The Valgreth Supreme Warlord composed his response personally. It took him 4 hours and 7 drafts. He was not a man who was accustomed to finding the right words for situations like this one, because no situation like this had ever existed before. When he finally transmitted it to Earth, the message was shorter than anyone expected. We were wrong. We offer our complete withdrawal from all occupied territories. We offer reparations for those we have harmed. We offer our cooperation in whatever form humanity finds appropriate. We ask only for the opportunity to make this right, and we ask it without expectation that the offer will be accepted, because we understand we have not earned that expectation. We are ready to learn. Kale Sundren read the message twice. Then he drafted his response. We accept your commitment to withdrawal and reparations. We do not accept your surrender, because we have no wish to own what you surrender. The Valgreth Dominion will continue to exist. It will simply exist differently than it has before. You will have help. He sent it. Then he walked to the window of the lunar facility and looked at the Earth below and thought about the Sharath, millions of years gone, who had looked up at stars full of nothing and decided to fill them with people. They could not have imagined it would come to this. Or perhaps they could. They had left very good notes.
The Gardeners of the Galaxy. 5 years after the solar battle, a small delegation arrived at Earth for the first time. They came from Ven Shara, the agricultural world that had spent 400 years under Valgreth occupation. Their species, the Venari, were tall and thin, with blue-gray skin and large eyes adapted for the dim light of their heavily clouded home world. They were, as a civilization, primarily farmers and artists and philosophers. They had not chosen occupation. They had not chosen 4 centuries of forced labor and cultural suppression. These things had happened to them the way catastrophes happen, suddenly and without any mechanism for appeal. The Valgreth withdrawal, driven by humanity's pressure and monitored by human observers who had stationed themselves throughout former Dominion space, had been completed 8 months after the solar battle. The occupied worlds were free. The practical reality of freedom, however, was complicated. 400 years was a long time. The Venari had to rebuild administrative systems that had been dismantled, educational programs that had been suppressed, cultural traditions that had survived only in secret. Humanity sent help, not an occupation force, engineers, teachers, logisticians, agricultural specialists, infrastructure planners. They came without authority over the Venari, without political agenda, without any expectation of compensation. They came because there was work to be done, and they were capable of doing it. Ambassador Sheila Torath, the Venari's senior representative to the new Cooperative Council, had overseen 5 years of reconstruction. She had watched her world slowly, painfully, hopefully become itself again. When the invitation came to attend the signing of the Cooperative Charter on Earth, she had accepted immediately. She stepped out of the shuttle onto Earth's soil on a morning in early spring and stopped. She had seen images. She had studied the planet extensively. She thought she was prepared. She was not prepared. The scale of biological diversity was overwhelming. Things grew everywhere. Not the efficient, managed agriculture of Venshara or the carefully contained ecosystems of the species she had dealt with in her diplomatic career. Earth grew rampantly, abundantly, with what seemed like joyful excess. Birds, insects, the sound of wind through trees, the smell of the air, complex and alive in ways she could not have anticipated. Kale Sundren met her personally. He had retired from active Solar Defense Authority command the year before and had taken the role of Earth's primary diplomatic representative to the cooperative. He was older now. The years since the battle had been busy ones. "It's more than the images suggest," Sheila said, looking at the trees lining the landing platform. "It always is," Sundren said. "We find that people who visit for the first time are often surprised by how loud it is. The ecosystem is very communicative." She smiled. It was the first genuine smile she had managed in what felt like days of ceremony and formality. They walked together through the grounds to the Cooperative Hall, a building designed by architects from 11 different species working in collaboration, each contributing structural elements from their own traditions and then negotiating how they fit together. The result was unusual and somehow harmonious, the way things are harmonious when they have been argued about honestly by people who genuinely want to find agreement.
The signing ceremony was attended by representatives from 312 species. Former enemies sat adjacent to each other and managed it, because the alternative was not sitting in this room at all, and this room was where the future was being built. Former slaves sat beside the representatives of civilizations that had enslaved them, and the discomfort in those seats was real and visible, and nobody pretended otherwise, because honesty was one of the founding principles of the document they were all about to sign. The cooperative charter was not an alliance. It was not a treaty in the conventional sense. It was an agreement about values, about the minimum standards that civilizations would hold themselves to in their relationships with other civilizations. Non-aggression was in there, with enforcement mechanisms that everyone present understood were backed by something that had erased 400 warships in 43 minutes. Prohibition of slavery, protection of cultural sovereignty, framework for dispute resolution, right of self-determination, obligation to aid species in catastrophic distress. It was not perfect. The debate over the final text had lasted 16 months and had included 17 points at which the entire process came close to collapse. There was one clause that 3 species still publicly disliked but had signed anyway, because the alternative to an imperfect agreement was no agreement, and they had all decided, in the end, that imperfect was acceptable. Humanity had written almost none of it. This was deliberate. We're not in the business of telling other people how to organize their civilization, Sundren had explained to a journalist at one point. We're in the business of making sure people have the space and safety to figure that out themselves. The Sharath didn't seed the galaxy so that their descendants could impose a single template on every species that evolved from that seeding. They seeded it because they believed minds were worth having, in all their variety. We try to honor that. After the ceremony, as the delegates moved through the reception,
Sheila found herself standing near a window with Sundran, looking out at the earth again.
My grandmother remembered the first day the Valgreth ships appeared in our sky, Sheila said quietly. She was 7 years old. She hid under a table because her parents told her to, and she could hear her parents crying in the next room. Sundran said nothing. He listened. For 400 years we told that story, not as history, as a wound, the day the sky became something to be afraid of. She was quiet for a moment. My daughter is 12 years old. She is studying xenolinguistics because she wants to work in the cooperative's diplomatic translation division. She looks at the sky the way I looked at the ground, like something good is happening up there. Sundran looked at her. Is that because of Earth? Sheila thought about it seriously, the way she thought about most things. It's because of the Charter, she said. Earth made the Charter possible, but the Charter belongs to everyone who signed it. She paused. That is the difference, I think, between a protector and a conqueror. A conqueror takes ownership. A protector creates conditions. Sundran nodded slowly. Outside, the earth turned in its ordinary way, as it had turned for billions of years, carrying its oceans and its forests and its cities and its impossible diversity of life. Somewhere in its outer system, the defense network rested dormant, patient, available. Somewhere on its moon, the Solar Defense Authority maintained its watch. In the asteroid belt and beneath the ice of distant moons, the inheritance of the Sharath waited, vast and ancient, and precisely as ready as it needed to be. The galaxy had spent millions of years growing up in the garden that the Sharath had planted. It had not always grown well. It had grown aggressively and painfully and with a great deal of suffering that the Sharath's descendants, watching from their quiet corner of the outer silence, had felt deeply and had not, until forced, intervened to stop. That time was over. The Valgreth Dominion had done something remarkable in the end. In coming to conquer, they had woken the gardeners. In flexing their 9,000-year-old power, they had provoked something 60 million years old into remembering its responsibilities. In looking at a blue-green world and seeing prey, they had found instead the thing that defines every encounter between something old and something arrogant. A correction.
Not a punishment, not a revenge, a correction, offered clearly, applied precisely, followed by an outstretched hand to a galaxy that had spent too long organized around fear. The Valgreth Supreme Warlord was, at this very moment, in a conference room 3 floors below, working through the specifics of the reparations framework with a Venari economic advisor and a human mediator. He had arrived without ceremony. He had asked for no special treatment. He had sat down at the table and opened his files and gotten to work. His empire was changing, slowly, painfully, with the grinding difficulty of any system that had operated one way for 9,000 years trying to operate differently. But it was changing. The galaxy had tried to take Earth and failed so completely that the attempt had become the hinge point of a new age. Humanity had not asked to be the hinge. They had not sought the moment. They had simply been what they were, patient and prepared, and deeply ancestrally committed to the idea that the minds scattered across the stars were worth protecting.
They had been sleeping, yes. They had been hidden, yes. But they had never stopped watching. And when the moment came, they had been ready in the way that only something very old and very certain of itself can be ready. Not with anger, not with revenge, with purpose. The galaxy was a garden. The gardeners had returned to their work, and for the first time in longer than most civilizations had existed, the stars were beginning to look like they might, one day, be genuinely safe.